a new series. Thank you very much. Yeah, this is, as Nina said, this is a new series um, on introducing people to Marxist classic texts, and we thought it was only right and proper, really, um, to start with perhaps the most famous and best known foundational Marxist text, and it's certainly one of the easiest to read and enjoy. Uh, the Manifesto is a pamphlet that was written jointly by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and first published in February 1848. It was addressed to the working class worldwide, and it was intended both as a political program and a call to action. And although it was written over 150 years ago, it continues to resonate today. Now, part of the reason for that, uh, I'm just picking up some noise. I'm just wondering if people might be able to mute their microphones if they haven't already. But yes, sorry, to continue, part of the reason for this is the sheer power of the manifesto's prose. The manifesto is a wonderful piece of literature in its own right. It begins with the famous line, "A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism." It contains phrases that have entered into the English language, such as the description, a famous description of the way that bourgeois society tears down the previous social order and its culture so that all that is solid melts into air. And then, of course, there's the famous injunction at the end of to the working class: "Proletarians of the world, unite! You have nothing to lose but your chains." So, as a piece of rhetoric and a piece of prose, it's still an amazing work to read. But to have entered our culture at all in the way that it has, the ideas in the manifesto would have to resonate. So what are the core ideas of this pamphlet written back in 1847 to 8, and why do they still resonate and motivate people now? And that's what I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about before we get into questions, which I would urge you to put in the chat as we go, and we'll pick them up at the end. So at the time that it was drafted in 1848, Europe was undergoing dramatic social and economic change. Industrialization, urbanization, and social upheaval were spreading out from England across the European continent as the capitalist mode of production became dominant. A growing industrial working class, the proletariat, in Marx's phrase, were coming into being, living often in grim conditions and exploited by a capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, that owned the means of production. And these two classes were increasingly pitched into conflict. Revolutionary and reformist movements were spreading across Europe at the same time, demanding political change from the monarchical political regimes that still held state power across European countries. These two trends demanding change increasingly collided, leading to a cross-germination of ideas and movements. And this culminated in the revolutions of 1848, a series of uprisings demanding political liberalization, democracy, and also increasingly workers' rights. Marx and Engels were part of a group of socialists called the Communist League, formed in 1847 out of groups of European workers and socialists, often living in exile. At its first Congress, the Communist League, in June 1847, Marx and Engels were asked to produce a creed, a concise statement of the League's goals and principles to be submitted to the Congress. Engels quickly produced a draft in the form of a series of questions and answers, effectively a catechism, a statement of belief. After a second drafting a second version, which he became known as the Principles of Communism, Engels wrote to Marx saying that this format wasn't really working and that there needed to be a manifesto containing historical and political analysis, as well as call for action. The proposal was accepted by the League at its second Congress in London in December, and after some delay, Marx went about quickly restructuring the contents of the principles into the Manifesto of the Communist Party, written in German and printed in London and serialized in the Deutsche Londoner Zeitung, a newspaper for German emigres. The day after it appeared, Marx was expelled from Belgium, where he'd been living. The manifesto's first English publication was in 1850, translated by Helen Macfarlane, a Scottish chartist, probably with the input of Engels, who had started his own translation, and serialized in the Red Republican, a chartist newspaper. Subsequent English translations of the Manifesto, including what's today the Communist 1888 edition, were edited by Engels, who added his own footnotes. So as the text arrives to us today, as it's published today, the Manifesto begins with a series of introductions to different editions, and each edition mentions the changes that have happened, that have taken place since the first publication. From the 1872 German edition, which declares that the Manifesto has become, to some extent, a historical document, as Engels notes, that we have no longer any right to alter, to later German, Russian, English, Polish, and Italian translations. But the text proper of the Manifesto starts with a preamble. Perhaps it's containing perhaps that most famous phrase, "A spectre is haunting Europe," the spectre of communism. It declares that communists should openly publish their beliefs and aims, and this preamble is followed by 4 main sections. So the Manifesto was intended, as I said a minute ago, as a creed. So its first 2 sections set out the ideological foundation of communists, according to Marx and Engels. In the first section, bourgeois and proletarians, as we'll see shortly, that first section contains their statement of the historic basis for the socialist challenge to capitalist society. The second section, proletarians and communists, contains their distinctive understanding of the role of communists in the working class movement. The third section, socialist and communist literature, is a lengthy critique of other socialist theories, reactionary, including feudal socialists, petty bourgeois socialists, and German or true socialism, conservative or bourgeois socialism, and critical utopian socialism and communism are all examined and rejected for being coercive, conservative, idealistic, reformist, or otherwise disconnected from the realities of class struggle. And the Manifesto ends with a section on the positions of the communists in relation to the various existing opposition parties. Now, this is the shortest and declares that, in short, the communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. And it concludes with perhaps the Manifesto's most memorable words: communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains, and they have a world to win. Reading the Manifesto now can be a little bit like looking back in time into an early industrializing Europe, and it is peppered with references to long past socialist movements. But there are 3 key ideas that I want to point out here that go some way to explaining why the Manifesto continues to inspire and motivate revolutionaries long after its publication and into today. The first key idea that I want to point to is the materialist conception of the basis and the case for socialism. In the first section of the Manifesto, Bourgeois and Proletarians, we have a crystallized presentation of the core ideas of Marx and Engels' historical materialism, their understanding of history, of the place of capitalism within that history, and the historic opportunity and task that is faced by socialists and the working class. Beginning with the famous statement that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles, Marx retells European history as one of the successive rise and fall of a series of modes of production, most recently the overthrow of feudalism and the unleashing of the vast productive forces of capitalism. This section contains some of Marx's most famous formulations as he charts the almost heroic manner in which capitalism smashes down the economic, social, and ideological structures of feudalism, and all that is solid, as he puts it, melts into air. However, capitalism, through the constant revolutionizing of production and its uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, as he expresses it, had transformed feudal society, leading to enormous growth in the means of production within a world market. Capitalists, the bourgeoisie, continuously exploit the proletariat, creating profit for themselves and accumulating capital. In doing so, however, the bourgeoisie becomes its own gravediggers because it brings into being a class with nothing to lose but its chains and creates the conditions through which they will become conscious of this fact and the need to change it. Capitalism is, in this way, they claim, like the sorcerer who conjures into being forces that they cannot control. Because it takes place through relations of private property, capitalist production is chaotic, unplanned, and animated by the selfish drive to profit. This leads to crises, which the capitalists respond to by destroying means of production, creating poverty, and enlarging the capitalist world still farther, which simply enlarges the scale of human society, which is subjected to its chaotic laws. Secondly, they argue capitalism creates the proletariat, a class alienated from the products of their labour, forced to sell their labour for wages, exploited, periodically thrown out of work by crises and the advance of machinery. These workers are thrown together by modern industry itself, which concentrates them in great organisations of work, and then forced to combine in unions to defend the price of their labour, forming in the process trade union movement. It is worth pausing to note here that because this text is written in 1848, Marx and Engels' understanding of capitalist crises and of the mechanics of capitalist exploitation, the creation of surplus value, and the inner crisis of laws of capitalism await Marx's more detailed studies in the 1850s and 1860s, culminating in the great work Capital. But if it lacks that detailed understanding of capitalist laws of motion, what the manifesto does contain is the fundamental insight into the basic contradictions that drive history, that create the capitalist mode, and that create the conditions for its transcendence. So the second key insight I want to point to is the transition from class in itself to class for itself. The manifesto contains insights into the way that in capitalist society, the working class comes into being, is forced to struggle, and rises in consciousness and organization. In the manifesto, Marx and Engels describe the fall of the bourgeoisie and the victory of the proletariat as being equally inevitable. But they don't say that it's straightforwardly inevitable. Capitalist society creates the conditions for the overthrow of capitalism, but it doesn't make it mathematically predictable. This depends on the organization and coming into consciousness of the working class. In the section on bourgeois and proletarians, Marx and Engels chart this process. Modern industry throws workers together and organizes them in production. Again, this is something that Marx develops his understanding of in the 1850s. Exploitation and crisis force workers to combine to form unions. Unions struggle and win partial and temporary victories, but the fundamental laws of the capitalist mode push them back time and again. The real fruit of these struggles, Marx and Engels say, is not the gains in wages and the conditions that might be won temporarily, but the compulsion to organize on an ever wider scale, eventually on a national scale, whereupon the workers begin to understand the need to wage a struggle over the national state apparatus against the bourgeoisie, organized on a national scale, and becoming in the process, they say, a political class struggle. This process of class formation is not straightforward and linear. It's really important. In a really important passage, Marx and Engels say that the unity of the workers is constantly being upset by the competition and crisis of capitalism. So that process of class formation is neither inevitable nor straightforward and linear, but it is rebuilt each time on a larger scale. The final key insight that I want to point to is the role of the communists as a party. So in the second section, proletarians and communists, this section defines the role of communists within the broader workers' movement. The communists, as distinct from socialists and others in the broader Workers' Party, they say, are the representatives of the general interest of the proletariat. They have no interest apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. Communists are the most conscious, thinking, and organizing part of the working class. The forces of capitalism will constantly throw workers together and drive them into struggle on an ever larger scale, as we saw above. But the specific task of the party, as the conscious expression of the general interest of the working class, is to organize the class to undertake its historic duty, which is the seizure of state power and the abolition of the private property relations that underpin the capitalist mode. That is the basic task of the party. How it does that will depend on historical and societal circumstances, but the general features of that process are lightly sketched out by Marx and Engels in the context of the late 1840s as winning the battle for democracy and using its political supremacy to wrest by degrees all capital from the bourgeoisie. They use measures, if you look at the list of measures that they propose, they look moderate and reformist, but which make up what they call despotic inroads into rights of private property. If it's able to make itself the ruling class and sweep away over time the conditions of bourgeois property that underpin the existence of classes and organize production on a new basis, given time, this would create a society in which, to quote, the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. So mapped out in brief here is the basis for what Marx and Engels would later theorize as the period of the dictatorship of the proletariat, a transitional form of political rule that would lead to the creation of a developed communist mode of production. So the Manifesto was first published just weeks before the revolutions of 1848 erupted across Europe. These revolutions took various forms, and their character was as much nationalist or liberal as socialist. While the pamphlet, the Manifesto of the Communist Party, circulated widely among radicals, it initially didn't have a massive influence, and Marx himself later joked that it was forgotten after the revolutions failed. But by the late 19th and 20th centuries, as socialist and labour movements grew, the Manifesto became one of the most influential political texts in history. It served as a foundational document for the international socialist and communist movements. It particularly grew in importance after the Bolshevik seizure of power in the Russian Revolution, and was a foundational political education text for communist parties across the world. And as a result, it became a core reference text for revolutionaries and political leaders who emerged in socialist states such as Russia, China, and Cuba, and in anti-colonial movements worldwide. In spite of the retreat of actually existing socialism, which formed the material basis for its massive distribution and influence, the Manifesto continues to inspire and impel revolutionaries today. And in part, I think, obviously, that's because of its soaring prose, some of the best that Marx ever wrote. But it is also, I think, because of these three key enduring insights and the fact that they remain valid to this day. Despite all of the changes and all of the developments of the capitalist mode of production, all of the developments of the political forms of capitalist rule, and all of the developments of the working class, in spite of that, these three core elements of the Manifesto retain validity. First, the historical materialist understanding of capitalism's origins and its crisis tendencies. It may have advanced in depth and sophistication, but the Manifesto remains the sharpest and pithiest expression of this in a popular form. Secondly, the understanding of how working classes form and rise in consciousness is also of enduring importance. It obviously took place in highly uneven ways, and arguably in ways that Marx and Engels couldn't exactly have foreseen. But we've seen that they allowed, in the Manifesto itself, they allow for the possibility, inevitability even, or reversals, of dispersal, and recomposition of classes under the pressure of capitalist accumulation, as well as for their recreation. The general dynamics of class formation and reformation that the manifesto maps out, and the conditions under which class consciousness can escalate, remain constantly active features wherever the capitalist mode is entrenched. And finally, the role of the Revolutionary Party, expressing the generalized interest of the working class, bringing together its most conscious thinking part in the work of organizing the class and raising its conscious ability to perform its historic role, remains of lasting value. It is the case that in every case where the working class has come to political power and challenged capitalist property relations, this has been under the leadership and guidance of a party that expresses this idea of itself. And in this way, in these three ways, I think the manifesto remains an intensely live and relevant text for us today. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. That was great. So I'm going to stop the recording now because we're going to open up for questions. Okay, so just bear with me 1 second.